when you're growing up in most churches, the way that the Bible, in American evangelical Christianity, um, the way it's presented to you is that, these men, just these men wrote these books, had these divinely inspired moments.
Hmm.
And it was just these men, only these men, no more, and that's it.
Yeah.
And anything outside of that is heresy.
Hmm.
And that is very much the way that it's presented. But historically, it doesn't seem like there's any context for that.
Yeah. And when we look at the way the Bible came together, and I made a video about this recently. When you look at
Yes,
Genesis 1 and then you look at Genesis 2 and 3,
I was going to
these are
bring that
two
up.
these are two different creation stories.
Yes,
And the one in Genesis 2 and 3 is probably earlier. It presents a more anthropomorphic, corporeal God that creates by manipulating the soil. And it talks about the day on which God made the earth and the heavens. And then you get Genesis 1, which is a later creation account. This is the priestly account, and this is a more transcendent deity. It doesn't talk about the God walking through the garden and making noise. It's just this God who creates by divine fiat. They speak and things come into existence. And
right.
a big difference is in the story of Adam and Eve, God creates Adam, and then God sees that it so has to try to through a process of trial and error create a suitable companion. And in Genesis 1, the big distinction there is God creates by divine fiat, and every time God creates, God sees that it was good. So this is not a God who makes mistakes. This is not a God who has to correct their work. This is a deity where everything is good right off the bat. But at one point, they got put together on a single scroll. And now people have to try to interpret them as a single narrative.
And
And so,
uncredited to the same writer.
right. And so when you have what the author of Genesis 1 was trying to communicate, you have what the author of Genesis 2 and 3 was trying to communicate, and then you have some editor who smacked them together right next to each other, and now the location of the authority is in that editor, whoever that was. We have no idea who they were. They didn't write anything. And so this notion that, oh, it was just these, I forget how, 45 inspired writers, and they were inspired, and therefore what they wrote was authoritative. But in reality, the book came together thanks to a lot of redactors and editors and copyists and scribes. And there's so much in there that so much of the meaning that people negotiate with the text is the work of those unnamed editors and scribes and copyists, and not the people who actually wrote the text. And so it gets really, really messy when you look at the data.
Yeah.
The notion that we attribute or ascribe inspiration and inerrancy and univocality to this text just gets obliterated once you understand how the text actually came together. There's no way to hold all of those things together. That the author of Genesis 1 was inspired and inerrant, but the author of Genesis 2 and 3 was also inspired and inerrant, because the texts conflict. They disagree with each other. And so it's one of the reasons I constantly say that the data don't support univocality, inspiration, inerrancy. Those are dogmas. That somebody came up with this idea, hey, it should be like this. This is how we should understand it. Not because the data indicate it, but because this is useful for our group. And
Right.
then other people had to just say, okay. And so it's a dogma is just something that people choose to accept. It's not something that's demonstrated. It's not something that is supported by any data.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then that makes, to me, that makes my brain go, yeah.
Yeah,
After,
it makes
reading
more
it,
sense.
and it makes more sense. It
Yeah.
makes, just like, evolution makes more sense than God creating an old earth. or
hiding dinosaur bones there, or the devil was hiding the stuff to throw us off.
To throw us off.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things I enjoy about critical scholarship is it produces explanations that are just intuitive and make sense.
Yes.
And things fall into place.
Yes.
Because you say, oh, well, that makes better sense. And that makes better sense to this other thing over here. And suddenly this other thing over here. But when you try to approach it from the perspective of these dogmas, you constantly have to fend off why it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And you just have to keep asserting over and over again, no, it has to be this way. It has to be this way. It has to be this way. Not because the data indicate, but because it's useful for our group's structuring of power and values and boundaries. And it's just more fascinating, too. I think it's more interesting. We allow the author's rhetorical goals to bubble to the surface, and it's more interesting to me. Some people think it's problematic, but to me, it's just a lot more interesting.